curriculum change from the past 5 years, all requiring parental notification and consent forms and board approval with public comment periods. But there was nothing about Chapalish, no record of the standard protocols being followed, no consent form sent home for parents to review and sign. Every other pilot program had opt-out procedures clearly listed, but Chapalish had appeared without any of those safeguards. The absence was obvious once I knew what to look for, this gap in the documentation where proper procedures should have been, but weren't, like someone had deliberately bypassed all the normal channels that were supposed to protect students and parents from experimental programs being imposed without permission. That evening, I created an anonymous account and posted in a local parent Facebook group describing concerns about a mandatory language program that had appeared without proper consent or transparency. I kept the details vague, not naming Chapalish specifically, but asking if other parents had noticed similar issues with new programs being implemented without notification or opt-out options. I wanted to gauge whether anyone else found this situation alarming, or if I was the only one who thought schools shouldn't be able to make kids participate in experimental programs without explicit permission. Within an hour, I had 3 comments, all from parents saying they trusted the school administration to make good decisions and that kids these days were too protected and needed to learn to adapt to new challenges. Nobody seemed concerned about the consent issue at all. By Wednesday, I was completely iced out of study groups, the isolation hitting me during lunch when I walked past a table where my friends were working together on homework. They saw me coming and got quiet, then went back to their conversation in a mix of English and Chapalish that I couldn't fully follow anymore. Nobody invited me to sit down or asked if I wanted to join their afternoon study session. Later, I overheard 2 girls from my history class talking about how I was making things harder for everyone by refusing to just go with the program, and one of them said I was being dramatic and difficult for no reason. Friends who used to text me daily had stopped reaching out, and the group chat I'd been part of since freshman year had gone silent whenever I posted anything. The message was clear that my questions and resistance were seen as disruptive and unhelpful, and people would rather exclude me completely than deal with my continued refusal to just accept what was happening. Thursday afternoon during class, I flipped to the back of my advanced Chapalish textbook, looking for the publication information, and I noticed a small vendor logo I'd never seen before, printed on the inside back cover. I wrote down the company name and spent that evening searching for connections between this vendor, our school district, and the 17 other schools teaching Chapalish. The company specialized in educational assessment technology and had contracts with several testing organizations, and their website mentioned partnerships with private foundations focused on standardized evaluation methods. I started sketching out a corporate trail, looking for financial connections and shared board members and any pattern that might explain why these specific schools were selected for this coordinated rollout. The vendor had received a large grant from a foundation right before our school year started, and that same foundation had connections to educational research programs studying language acquisition and cognitive assessment methods. That evening, I pulled up Reddit and searched through my saved posts until I found usernames from 3 students who'd commented in that deleted thread before it disappeared. I sent each of them a direct message asking if their advanced Chapalish textbooks had the same vendor logo on the back and whether their schools got any special funding right before the program started. 2 responded within an hour, both confirming their books had identical logos and that their districts received grants from something called an Educational Innovation Foundation just weeks before Chapalish launched. The 3rd student never replied, but the pattern was clear enough that 17 schools didn't just randomly decide to teach the same made-up language on the same Monday morning. Friday morning, I showed up at the guidance office before first period and asked to talk with Gregory Madden about my grades and stress levels. He waved me into his office and listened while I explained how my GPA was dropping because I couldn't focus in Chapalish class and how all my friends had stopped including me in study groups. He nodded and made sympathetic sounds, but then leaned forward and told me I needed to stop fighting battles I couldn't win and focus on my actual schoolwork instead of playing detective. He said the program was approved by people with way more information than I had access to, and that I was creating my own problems by refusing to just go along with something that was clearly helping other students succeed. The meeting ended with him suggesting I use my energy on homework instead of activism, and reminding me that colleges wouldn't care about my concerns if my transcript showed failing grades. I walked out feeling worse than when I went in, because even the counselor whose job was supposed to be helping students was telling me to shut up and accept what was happening. That evening, My mom found me in my room, staring at my laptop screen full of notes and research, and she sat down on my bed with this careful expression. She said she'd been thinking about everything I told her, and while she understood why I was upset, I needed to work through proper channels instead of just complaining online and getting myself isolated at the school. She suggested we write a formal letter to the school board with specific questions about the program's approval process and funding sources, something professional that adults would actually take seriously instead of dismissing as teenage drama. She offered to help me draft it over the weekend, so it focused on real policy questions instead of just saying the whole thing felt wrong. We spent Saturday afternoon at the kitchen table working on the letter together, my mom helping me organize my scattered concerns into clear paragraphs that asked about parental consent procedures and transparency requirements, and whether the board even knew about the foundation funding. Sunday morning, I posted in that parent Facebook group again, with a more measured tone, asking if anyone else wanted more information about the pilot program. And this time I got a response from someone named Camilla Zimmerman, who said she was a reporter covering local education issues. She sent me a private message saying my concerns sounded worth looking into, and asked if I'd be willing to talk on the phone about what I'd observed. And she mentioned she could walk me through how Freedom of Information Act requests actually worked if I wanted to request official documents from the district. Monday afternoon, I called Camilla from my room with my door closed, and we talked for almost an hour about everything I'd documented over the past months. She asked detailed questions about the timeline and the vendor information and the other schools, taking notes the whole time and occasionally saying things like, "That's interesting," or "That doesn't sound right." Then she explained how FOIA requests let citizens ask government agencies for records and documents, and she helped me figure out exactly what questions to ask the school district and state education department. She walked me through the specific wording I needed to use to request approval records, funding source documents, and any contracts with private companies, and she explained what kinds of responses I should expect and what it meant if they redacted information or claimed certain things were confidential. Tuesday morning before school, I filled out the FOIA request forms online, typing in the exact language Camilla had helped me craft about Chapalish program approval processes and funding agreements and vendor contracts. I hit submit on both the district request and the state education department request, then sat back feeling this weird mix of official and powerless because now I had to wait 30 days for them to respond. Camilla texted me that afternoon saying good job on filing the requests and reminding me that transparency takes time and patience, that this was how the system worked, even when it felt slow and frustrating. The waiting felt impossible when I wanted answers immediately, but at least I was doing something concrete instead of just asking questions nobody would answer. 2 weeks crawled by with me checking my email obsessively, until finally a message appeared from the district's records department with a PDF attachment. I opened it and found 20 pages of documents, but most of them were covered in thick black redaction bars that blocked out whole paragraphs and sections. What I could read mentioned a private foundation providing grant funding and multiple references to non-disclosure agreements that restricted what information could be shared publicly. The response included a cover letter explaining that certain details were protected by contractual obligations and couldn't be released under FOIA exemptions, which just made me more suspicious about what they were hiding. I forwarded everything to Camilla within minutes, with a message saying this raises way more questions than it answers. She called me that evening, and we went through the documents together line by line, with her explaining the legal language and helping me understand what the unredacted portions actually meant. She'd already started researching the foundation name that appeared in a few places and discovered it specialized in educational technology and standardized testing, not language instruction or cultural programs. Their website materials described something called controlled lexicon assessment, which sounded nothing like learning a real language for communication. Camilla found research papers the foundation had published about creating bias-free testing environments by using completely neutral vocabulary that eliminated cultural advantages, and suddenly, the whole Chapalish program started making sense in a completely different way than I'd been thinking about it. I sat at my desk that night reading through the foundation's materials, and the pieces clicked together in my head. This wasn't about teaching us a language that existed in some other country or preparing us for global communication. The program was creating a standardized testing tool that worked by forcing everyone to think within the same tight grammatical rules and limited vocabulary, so nobody had cultural or linguistic advantages over anyone else. Listen to 90 Seconds and rate me 5 stars on Spotify. Doing a giveaway for people who did this and show proof on my Instagram. There will be 4 winners, and you get to choose between a Spotify or Amazon gift card. The clarity everyone kept talking about wasn't some magical property of Chapalish, but just the cognitive ease of working inside a system with no room for interpretation or creative expression. Students weren't becoming fluent in communication. They were being trained to produce specific predetermined responses using exact structures that could be easily measured and compared across different schools and populations. I started rewriting my concerns in a new document, shifting away from arguing that Chapalish was fake toward asking questions about consent and transparency and whether schools could turn students into research subjects without telling them. The issue wasn't whether controlled lexicon testing had educational value. It was whether districts could implement experimental programs funded by private foundations without informing parents or giving families the option to opt out. It was whether students should be test subjects for corporate research about language acquisition and cognitive assessment without anyone explicitly agreeing to participate in a study. The program might work exactly as designed, but that didn't make it okay to roll it out in 17 schools without proper consent procedures or honest communication about what was really being tested and measured and who was collecting the data and why. Wednesday afternoon, I pulled up the district website and found the school board member contact information listed in a public directory. Eli Reardon's email address was right there, along with his photo and a short bio about serving on the board for 6 years. I opened a new message and started typing, keeping my tone respectful and curious rather than angry or accusatory. I explained I was a student in the Chapalish program and had obtained FOIA documents showing private foundation funding, NDAS, restricting transparency, and no parental consent procedures for what appeared to be educational research. I attached the relevant documents and asked if he was aware of these elements when the board approved the program. I read through the email 3 times before hitting send, making sure every sentence focused on specific procedural questions rather than attacking anyone personally. The message went through and I closed my laptop, not expecting to hear back for weeks, if at all, since board members probably got hundreds of emails from concerned parents and students. Thursday morning, I woke up to a response from Eli that completely surprised me. He said he'd like to meet briefly to discuss my questions and suggested my mother attend as well since these concerns involved district policy. He admitted he wasn't aware of NDAS or private foundation involvement when the board reviewed the program, and he sounded genuinely interested in understanding what I'd discovered rather than dismissive like the principal had been. I showed the email to my mom before school, and she immediately agreed to meet with him, saying she wanted to hear directly from a board member about how this program got approved without proper transparency. We scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday at a coffee shop near the school, which felt surreal because I'd never imagined a school board member would actually take my concerns seriously enough to meet in person. Tuesday afternoon, my mother and I walked into the coffee shop and found Eli already sitting at a corner table with a notepad in front of him. He stood up to shake our hands and thanked us for taking the time to meet, then asked me to walk him through what I'd discovered. I pulled out the printed FOIA documents and spread them across the table, pointing out the references to private foundation funding, the contractual restrictions on information sharing, and the data collection protocols that were never mentioned to parents. Eli read through each page carefully, and his expression shifted from polite interest to visible discomfort as he absorbed the details about NDAS and research purposes. He explained the board's approval process had focused entirely on the educational benefits of adding a language option, with the principal presenting Chapalish as an innovative pilot program that would give students competitive advantages. Nobody mentioned private foundation involvement or research protocols or contractual restrictions on transparency, and Eli said if he'd known about those elements, he would have asked very different questions during the approval meeting. Eli closed the folder and said he was going to request that Chapalish be added as an agenda item for the next board meeting, so these questions could be addressed publicly. He explained the board approved the program based on limited information, and if there were transparency issues or consent gaps, those needed to be corrected regardless of how well the program worked educationally. My mother asked what the timeline looked like, and Eli said the next meeting was in 3 weeks, which meant we had time to gather any additional documentation or parent concerns that should be part of the public discussion. He thanked me again for bringing this to his attention and said it took courage to question something everyone else seemed to accept without problem. Walking back to the car, My mother squeezed my shoulder and said she was proud of how I'd handled the meeting, staying focused on facts and procedures rather than getting emotional or defensive. Thursday after school, the chapelish teacher caught me in the hallway and asked quietly if we could talk for a minute. We stepped into an empty classroom and she closed the door, then asked why I was trying to undermine the program when it was helping so many students learn faster and think more clearly. I explained I wasn't against students learning chapelish, but against the lack of informed consent and transparency, and I said parents deserve to know about the research component and foundation funding before their kids were enrolled in what was presented as just a language class. She looked tired and stressed, admitting she was under enormous pressure from the administration to maintain enrollment numbers and show positive outcomes because the grant funding depended on participation rates. She said she'd wanted to be more transparent from the beginning, but the NDAs she signed restricted what she could discuss about the program's origins and purposes, and she felt trapped between doing her job and being honest with students and parents about what was really happening. The following Monday, the principal called me to his office during lunch, and I knew before I even sat down that this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. He started by saying he'd heard I was spreading misinformation that could damage the school's reputation and put important educational opportunities at risk. I tried to explain about the FOIA documents and the meeting with Eli, but he cut me off, saying my activism was creating unnecessary controversy and making other students uncomfortable when they just wanted to focus on learning. He never addressed any of my specific questions about NDAS or consent procedures, instead focusing on how my behavior was disruptive and how I needed to think about the bigger picture of what was best for the school community. I left his office feeling angry and frustrated because he'd completely ignored the substance of my concerns and tried to frame everything as me being difficult rather than the administration failing to follow proper procedures. That evening, Alex texted me a long message saying he didn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of this when colleges were already starting to recognize chapelish proficiency on applications. He said our friendship had been strained for weeks, and he was tired of feeling like he had to choose between supporting me and participating in something that was actually helping his future. The message felt like a breaking point where he was choosing the practical benefits of going along with the program over supporting my right to question it. I read the text 3 times and didn't respond because I didn't know what to say that wouldn't make things worse between us. Camilla called me Wednesday evening with news that changed everything about how I understood the principal's role in this program. She'd been digging through public records and foundation materials and discovered the principal sat on an advisory panel for the same foundation funding the chapelish pilot program. This was a significant conflict of interest that was never disclosed to the board or parents, and it explained why he'd been so defensive about transparency questions. Camilla asked if I was comfortable with her including this information in a story she was planning to publish before the board meeting. And I said yes, because parents deserved to know about the financial connections that might be influencing how the program was presented and defended. My mother called the school Thursday morning and requested a formal meeting with the principal to discuss transparency and parental notification procedures. She brought printed copies of the FOIA documents showing the NDAS and foundation involvement, laying them out on his desk and asking direct questions about why parents weren't informed about the research component. The principal became defensive, insisting the program was properly approved and parents had been notified through regular school communications about new course offerings. My mother pointed out there was a difference between announcing a new language class and disclosing that students would be research subjects in a private foundation study, and she said the lack of opt-out procedures was particularly concerning. The principal agreed to provide more information to parents, but framed it as clarification rather than admission of any procedural failures, and my mother left the meeting feeling like he was more worried about protecting the school's reputation than addressing legitimate consent issues. 3 days before the scheduled board meeting, the district sent out a memo to all families with students enrolled in chapelish. The memo reframed the program as an optional enrichment opportunity pending comprehensive review, which was the first time anyone had suggested it might not be mandatory. The language was carefully worded to sound like this was always the plan, describing the program as a pilot initiative that families could choose to continue or discontinue based on their individual preferences. My mother read the memo twice and said the sudden shift suggested the administration was worried about public scrutiny at the upcoming board meeting. I saved a copy of the memo because it contradicted everything we'd been told for months about chapelish being a required part of the curriculum, and the timing made it obvious this was a response to the questions Eli and other board members were starting to ask about consent procedures and transparency. The social split happened fast. Within days of the memo going out, you could see clear lines forming in the hallways between kids who thought I was making a big deal out of nothing and kids who started questioning whether this whole thing was actually okay. People stopped sitting together at lunch based on which side they were on, and group chats divided into pro-Chapolish channels and questioning channels. I never wanted to be the face of anything, but suddenly everyone knew I was the one who filed the FOIA requests and talked to the reporter and got my mom involved. Conversations would stop when I walked past groups in the hallway, and I could feel people watching me, judging whether I was brave or just causing problems for no reason. Some kids started calling me paranoid in their social media posts without using my name, but everyone knew who they meant. The worst part was seeing friends I'd known since middle school choosing sides, deciding whether my questions mattered more than the benefits they were getting from being fluent in Chapolish. I spent Tuesday night thinking about what to do next, and I realized attacking the program itself wasn't going to work because too many people liked it and were doing well in it. But consent and transparency were different. Those were principles that should matter to everyone, regardless of how they felt about Chapolish. I started drafting a petition Wednesday morning before school, keeping the language focused and specific. The petition didn't say Chapolish was bad or demand it be shut down. It asked for 3 things: complete information about funding sources and research purposes, voluntary participation with no academic penalties for opting out, and proper consent procedures going forward for any similar programs. I printed 20 copies in the library and started approaching people I thought might sign. The first few conversations were awkward because I had to explain I wasn't trying to end the program, just make it optional and transparent. Some people refused immediately, saying they didn't want drama or didn't see the point, but others read the petition carefully and said the consent stuff made sense even if they planned to keep taking Chapolish. By Thursday, I had 15 signatures, and by Friday, I had 30. Over the next week, I kept collecting signatures during lunch, before school, and between classes. I approached kids I barely knew, explaining the petition in the same careful way each time. Some signed because they agreed with my concerns about the NDAS and foundation involvement. Others signed because they believed in procedural fairness, even though they loved Chapolish and thought I was overreacting. A few teachers signed too, quietly, when I caught them alone in their classrooms. They didn't want to be public about it, but they agreed students and parents deserved complete information before being enrolled in experimental programs. The petition grew to 50 signatures, then 70, then 90. I kept a spreadsheet